So our whole family comes from the standpoint of service to our nation. Our daughter didn't get drilled to do it. She came around to do it on her own. She went to industry first because the money was great, but she gave up 40% of her salary after 2 years to come into the government. And why did she do that? Because she felt this need to do something bigger than herself and to have a sense of doing something nobody else can do.
This is KBcast.
Are they completely
As a
cybersecure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is
that's used to
security and
point
testing and performance and scalability.
Risk and
We
compliance.
can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me now is George Barnes, former Deputy Director at NSA and President Cyber Practice at Red Cell Partners. And today we're discussing your journey from the NSA to the private sector. So, George, thanks for joining and welcome.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm just really looking forward to our discussion and going over the highlights of what I've done and what I'm learning nowadays.
Yeah, so George, you and I met recently in person at the 2020 Partners event in Miami for context, and we sort of spoke a little bit about your background, which I was really fascinated in. So I'm really excited to get into that, and I want to highlight your career because it is quite extensive. You know a lot of stuff. You've been in the game a long time, and I really want our listeners to appreciate your pedigree. So maybe start like tell us everything, what comes up when I ask you that question.
Sure. I started as an electrical engineer, and my father had worked for the US Navy. And so he had exposed me to national defense, the concept of our allies and our position and our focus and purpose in the world. And so that was at the formative stages as I was growing up around him in his midst. And our family was always into service, public service, and trying to do things that mattered in society. And so that kind of launched me into electrical engineering. I worked for the Navy when I was in college, but then coming out, I learned about the National Security Agency, which had been in Maryland, but I never knew it existed all the way, at least halfway through college. I didn't know, and it was not even 20 miles away because back then it was no such agency. It was very secretive, not well understood. Not many people knew about it. They just knew of it from the random book that might have come out, which did or didn't really reflect what it was about. So I was enamored by it because I had some study partners that were co-ops as they were doing their studies, and that gave me some exposure. I applied and I got in. My journey started. So I came in right at the ground level, right out of school. Took me 9 months to get my clearance, which was normal back then, and I think is pretty much normal now. But I waited and I didn't take on other jobs. I took on basically menial jobs while I was waiting because I didn't want to start a new career and then have to set back and try to restart this one. I really wanted to get into the government. It had been the path that I had always really looked toward, given my parents. And so I had my eyes set on government, and what NSA represented was just appetizing to me. And so I jumped in and I started my career. I was able to have several overseas assignments, which was one of the benefits of working in national security and the intelligence community. And so I got to live for 3.5 years in Germany. And then later in my career, I lived for 3 years in London. And those were just wonderful opportunities, both for family, but also to get a perspective of the world more broadened and the United States' role in the world, how we're regarded, the role we have, the purpose we must pursue. And so those really motivated me to stay engaged. And, I went up through various stages of technical activities, technical leadership, and then organizational leadership. Ended up as the deputy director for my last 6.5 years from 2017 to 2023 when I retired. So that's 36 and a half years in a couple minutes.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot going on. One of the things you said that was just interesting. So you said your dad was obviously in the US Navy. Would you say other people that have taken a similar path to you, their parents were from like a military sort of background as well? Because I mean, a lot of those people have influence on what their parents do. It's like, oh, like when I grow up, I want to be like my dad or something like that. Like we've seen a lot of that then. Did you say you were heavily influenced by that as well?
I was heavily influenced by it. And also, I was in a community that was very rural, and where I worked, which is now where the NAV Air is down in St. Mary's County, Maryland, that was the big deal. That was the big employer. We went to air shows when I was growing up. So, of course, as a kid, I was enamored by Blue Angels and all the aircraft. And my dad got to work on aircraft. And so subsequently, I did when I was in college. And so just that whole concept of airplanes, jets, and those types of things, which young boys are and girls are interested in. And then, but then just really the focus on serving. And so I do meet and have met throughout my career a lot of people, families who kind of they're those exposures, they sow deep seeds. Our daughter actually works in the intelligence community as an example. She started off in industry out of the university, but after a few years, she decided that she wanted to follow the path of service to our country. And so it does, I think it's probably due to exposure, you feel that calling and you get exposed to the things that people in our governments get to do that are unique and different from what many in the private sector get to do. And so that gives you a sense of direction, purpose, relevance, all manner of positive feedback that comes from serving.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting as well, George? Like when I met you originally at the 2020 partner event in person, and then some of the other folks there as well, one of the things that was quite obvious to me was just driven by a mission. I've noticed that obviously I've been living here for 4 months now, but I have really noticed that a lot with US based citizens, just maybe the level of drive and the commitment to the mission, perhaps, than like other countries. And then you mentioned before you obviously did a stint in Germany and London. Like, what do you think their sort of sentiments are? Do you think it's similar? I just find that there's this US based, like, mission centric, this is what we're here to do. And I think that it just stands out so prominently for me.
It's that, and it was also for me and, many of my peers, a sense of responsibility even. And so, given all the negative forces in the world, I mean, when I started my NSA career, it was the end of the Cold War. And so were in locked, staring down the Soviet Union and trying to bring them to the point that they actually came, which was wonderful. And it was neat to be in service at that time. But from then forward, just the whole concept of the things that we cherish in our democracies, the things that our democracies stand for, and the things that the autocracies stand for. And those are juxtaposed against each other. And so, being in the US, having had the role we had in World War II, coming out, working with the global community to create all the things that have created nominal stability and peace for so many decades now, just this feeling that we had a role that we needed to do our part to sustain that, persist it, and spread it to the degree we could. And so I did feel this push and a passion to be in the middle of that, to be relevant, providing my part with others. And so that was not limited just to government people. I mean, I've had many, many counterparts in industry and academia who have been connected to these missions from their vantage points. And so by no means do you have to be in the government, but I chose that path and it basically created all the opportunities I've had, the opportunities to actually have impact, and then the opportunities to just have rich exposures, such as living overseas, traveling the world, visiting war zones, and seeing the trauma that our forces were exposed to, but also the trauma of the civilians who lived in these war torn areas. And so, being in the US, I just always felt the drive to be part of doing something better for the world.
So then, to your point, you've been in you've been in NSA, well, you were, sorry, in the NSA for like 35, 36 years. So you would have really seen things change over that time. So I'm sort of curious to understand, how has the function of cybersecurity evolved? Obviously, the central pillar of intelligence, defense, geopolitical sort of leverage as well. So walk me through how that's changed, because it's quite a substantial amount of time as well.
Yeah, significant change. Everything's changed. And look at the rate of change right now. In my career, I lived through several substantive changes in global society, driven by technology, really. And that's technology for interconnectedness, but also even technology for medicine. I mean, just look at the ways technology has matured, manifested itself, and had an impact on how our society lives and operates. And so, when I came into NSA, we did have computers. They were standalone IBM PCs. And there were some networked computers that I didn't have access to my first couple of years, but it was very different. But cybersecurity was in its formative stage. It had been around since, smoke signals in some respects. Indians used security, communication security, and cybersecurity grew out of that as the world became connected more and more. And so, the foundation of NSA and our partnerships with the Five Eyes nations really centered around cryptography and both making those codes and breaking them. And so, and many know the stories of World War II and the role that at that time, most notably the US and the UK played in breaking significant ciphers used by the Japanese and the Germans. And they saved untold lives and shortened the war by a lot of time. And so that was kind of the foundation. And then, of course, it went beyond cryptography. Cryptography still is around and it's more important now than ever because everything in society is connected. It used to just be governments, but now all of us use all of these devices, all these apps, all of our information is out there, and we rely on cryptography to try to keep it secure from others. That's all been surrounded by digital networking. And so cybersecurity took off. When the internet took off, that really created a whole new dimension bridging from point to this whole global mesh of networks that need to be secured, and the whole protocol stack needs trust and security at every layer. And so, being at NSA through that whole time, I watched those different evolutions of technology and some revolutionary technology come into the fore, get mainstreamed, and then we not only had to figure out how to secure it for our own defenses, but also how to understand how to get through it when it came to getting into our adversaries who were using advanced technologies. In the Cold War, there were basically two worlds. There was the Soviet world and its span of technologies that were indigenously produced, and then the Western world that melted down a bit after the fall of the wall, and everybody pursued kind of a common set of technologies. But now that's changing again. As an example, China is pursuing its own trust stack, its own software stack, operating system stack. And so they are kind of pulling away, in a manner of speaking, from the global community of networking. And that's something that we have to be very mindful of what it means for us, their participation, their influence in the things that we use, but also what they're doing to try to secure themselves.
So one thing that's interesting to me, George, as you were speaking, what was coming to my mind is if you look back on the 35, 36 years, would you say where we are today with all the breaches that are happening and, due to geopolitical tensions that are rising across like even allied countries, but just more broadly, do you think that the problem has gotten worse? Now, I caveat that with saying, like back in the day, like, even in the 90s, like the internet only came out like in terms of consumer level, like mid-90s, right? And then, like, television was, like, limited, you didn't have all the channels that you had now, and you had, like, one newspaper in the town that you lived at. So, do you think that the problem has always been this severe, but we weren't exposed to it? Whereas now it's like everyone's got social media and camera phones and everyone can document more, so it maybe feels like more, but it's kind of the same.
No, it's actually more intensified just because these technologies have become interwoven with humanity. And look, we're on the brink of a whole nother step change in that right now. It's happening before us as we look at advanced technologies in AI and we talk about synthetic personas and autonomous networks and autonomous agents taking on functions that heretofore only humans were able to conduct. And so, up until that point, we've had this continuous intensification in uptake and adoption of technology that has touched every corner of society. And, one of the pivotal moments I look back on really, the internet, of course, and the dot com kind of came into creation, as you mentioned, in the mid to late 90s and then turn of the century. But then 2007 is when the first iPhone came out. And that basically brought networking into people's hands. They had obviously started using networking and the internet from their desktops and their laptops more and more. But when it came into your hand and that mixed with the rise of social media and the rise of apps that could be developed and put onto our phones for all manner of things that we could conceive and couldn't conceive, we became a digital society. And we've leveraged that. And with every successive enhancement, we jump at the speed, the efficiency, the power of what data can do when harnessed through apps to perform functions that we want. And so there's a reliance there that today's society has that yesterday's society didn't have as much. And that's very powerful, but it also can create weaknesses. And, one of the things we're struggling with now is in the age of AI, just the whole thing about education and what's important for people to learn. We're on this continuous migration of technology, and naturally, there's certain things that I learned in school that people today don't need to learn. But there are other things that I learned that people aren't learning or they're not having to learn because they have answers at their fingertips. And so education is a big question. What is required to force the mind to develop, to be used so that it can actually push us higher? And how does technology jeopardize some of that learning and brain development because technology and access to data and information has become an easy crutch. And so we aren't memorizing, we're not developing our brains the same way. Now, maybe that's just okay. And in retrospect, it'll be fine, but it's a little bit scary now because I feel like we don't remember anything because if we need something, we just type it in and the answer comes to us. And so I feel like our brains are becoming more transactional rather than deep thinking oriented.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I've spoken a little bit about this on the show, and people have been expressing their concerns. So then, and I know we're going to sort of talk about like employment, like, how do people get into it, like as a younger generation, NSA, etc. But how does that really leave us? Because you're right, like even before like the iPhone came out, like you had to literally get like a map and like how to navigate somewhere, or you had to remember how to go from your house to your workplace.
Exactly.
Now, you don't need to do that. You just plug it in, you could go wherever. Now, whilst that has created opportunity, now I think that with this over reliance, then, on like you said, we can just type it in and get an answer. How does this going to look then? I mean, what do you honestly think when I ask you that question? When you sit back, like, how's this going to impact like our society, our governments? How we're going to protect our countries from a national cybersecurity perspective if people just aren't remembering sort of things day to day?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's an important period in our history, and it looks back to this intersection of culture, education, purpose, opportunity. There are all these macro things, and they're actually converging and intersecting. And so, I think about we have been very lucky in our country. In general, not exclusively by any means, but in general, our standard of living is very high, and we've enjoyed that for many, many years. I worry that it's been since it's been more easy for us, those of us that have had access to it, and there's a large number of us that have not, but those who've had access to it, it's been easier. And I worry that and I talk to colleagues about the change in work ethic. And, when I came along, my parents, lived through the Great Depression of the 30s, right? And so they had a very serious work ethic that kind of got pushed down to the next generation because I watched what they suffered through. My dad wasn't able to get higher than a GS-10 in the government because he didn't finish his college degree because he had to leave and go work on the farm in World War II, blah, blah, blah. And so they worked, they focused. And I worry that when you look at a lot of the growing population, I worry about work ethic. Now it's a matter of, okay, if I can just type into my map and I go to work. I do this, whenever I go down, I travel all over DC area. And so I use Waze because I need to get places. There's a lot of traffic, and I know Waze will take me the most expeditious way because it's dynamically learning about the traffic situation ahead, right? And so I'm seeing all kinds of areas that I never would have seen, but I basically put it into the hands of Waze to get me there because I know it's thinking about it and I'm thinking about other things. And that's great. But luckily, I've lived around here, so I kind of know where it's taking me, whereas most people haven't. And so a lot of people don't know how to get places that they don't have a navigator system. And so that's just an easy example, but we're at this point now, I mean, you're seeing it in the news, I'm seeing it in industry where, companies don't wanna hire, junior software developers right out of school now because AI is taking over that role. Now, maybe that's a natural progression, but we have a couple things happening. We have manufacturing is changing due to technology. And so a lot of what has heretofore been pushed off to really offshore for the access to cheap labor. Well, that part of industry is now being automated. And now the tech sector is being increasingly automated through software development, through AI engines. And so the big question is what will happen to society? A piece of it will continue to go up, a piece of it might become stagnant, and that begs a question for what's the what are the employment opportunities? How do kids know what to pursue in learning that's going to give them the confidence and security of a path towards, independence and, family security and those types of things. And so I think we're both at an exciting time, but we're also at a point where things are changing much more rapidly than we're ready to deal with them. And so we need to make sure we don't just run headlong without thinking through the ramifications of what we're doing.
Engineering teams are increasingly being pulled into the compliance conversation, and it's not where you want your sprint hours going. Vanta automates the painful bits of ISO 27001, SOC 2, and GDPR, so your team can spend less time on audits and more time building things that matter. Visit vanta.com/kbcast. That's VANTA.com/kbcast to learn more. And how would you suggest that we deal with them? Because you make great points. And these are some of the points that people, like when I'm talking to them, like, hey, my kids at uni or college, like they're kind of doing this, but I don't know whether there's longevity in that career. What do you think? So how do you think we're dealing with this sort of stuff in the United States, but just, across like in Australia and New Zealand and these sort of places as well? Or do you think people are not dealing with it?
There are a lot of wonderful people that are trying to deal with it. The challenge is, well, there are a couple. Number one, not only are we in a situation of rapid technology uptake, we're in a increasingly polarized world where we have a race for technology adoption, but also a race for technology supremacy. And so on the one hand, we should be thoughtful about the adoption of some of these technologies because of the ramifications on society. On the other hand, if we sit here and think, and we see it play out, the Chinese are rolling out all these new AI models, and they're going to do it whether or not we come along or not. And there will be a piece of society a large piece that will just go wherever the opportunity seems to be. And so if we pause, they're not going to pause, and that'll throw us deeper into things that we don't understand putting up for our access. And so it's a quandary. It's a global issue, but it's a global issue in the presence of a polarized world and also a world where, we in the West and my exposure to China, we look at things differently from the standpoint of national security and what constitutes espionage, and I spent all my decades in the espionage and cyber business, and we separated government from the markets and industry. And so it was a very clean, discrete line. We didn't do anything to support our free market society. And that was just kind of the rules of the domain. Well, China's not doing that. They're collecting intelligence to favor their companies to compete back against us. And they're drilling into our networks and our companies to steal their intellectual property and then designing and selling back against our markets. And so that's a situation. They're so big and powerful, and we have to figure out how to engage globally. And they're all different thoughts about how to push back and how to get to a different level of, I'll call it detente. But it's very complex, in the rate of technology change and adoption and access is exacerbating that situation.
So going back to your comment before around work ethic,
Mhm.
does it concern you that the next sort of generation may not want to take up careers in the government? Now, what I'm finding when I'm speaking to younger folks, I'm a millennial, but even the Gen Zers and the folks below me, etc., and the new kids up and coming, their sort of typical job is like, I want to be a YouTuber, a TikToker. Whilst there's nothing wrong with that for someone who works in modern media, it's just, does that concern you a little bit that we may not have the right people, maybe a deficit of people to be able to protect the nation, like moving forward, like the next 5, 10 years?
Most definitely. I mean, we need to continue to expose our children to the opportunity for service because that brings a gratification. And I use the example of our daughter who's in service in national security, and she has friends that are working jobs fully remote, getting paid a lot more than she is. And they basically don't do much work because the technologies for monitoring how much you do that's outcome based are still evolving. And I know a lot of companies have had develop technologies to see if their personnel are actually working. And there's working from the standpoint of, okay, my have my am I engaged with my computer device working that it's actually turning into something meaningful and profitable. And so there are all different ways to look at that. But I see just through talking to our daughter and her social network, this broad spectrum of the drive for part of it's fear of missing out, but there's a part of society that just wants to drive for continuous intensity in your senses. And so travel and all kinds of things. And others, they're less patient to like build and wait and I won't say earn their vacations, but they want to be doing it all the time. So a lot of people nowadays, because of ever since COVID, people have been freed from the office. If you have a laptop and internet, you're good. And that's great. I leverage it. But that combined with challenges in work ethic and challenges with being connected to the entity for whom you're working or serving, those create challenges. And so I think there's less loyalty to companies because people don't really know their companies. They're on the other end of a spigot from their apartment or their cabin or wherever they are. And so their loyalty is to themselves. The neat thing about working for the government is, yes, you have to take care of your own career, but you get swept up to this broader purpose, this drive for outcomes that basically backstop our liberal democracies that we have in our countries. And of course, in the US, the Constitution rings just loud and clear. And I have a copy of it sitting in my office here just because there's so much there that we have stood for and stand for and need to continue to push in the world that just talks about human liberty, right? And we can't take that for granted. And so when you work for the government, especially in national security and defense and those types of things, but not strictly those, you feel that sense of being on that team that's taking that ball down the field and keeping it in play for good, right? And so I was propelled, our daughter was propelled, my wife was a Marine. So our whole family comes from the standpoint of service to our nation. Our daughter didn't get drilled to do it. She came around to do it on her own. She went to industry first because the money was great, but she gave up 40% of her salary after 2 years to come into the government. And why did she do that? Because she wanted and she felt this need to do something bigger than herself and to have a sense of doing something nobody else can do. I can go work at TikTok and I can write code. Well, so can 1,000 other people. And that can be great if you're into code writing, but what's the purpose of its use, right? And so it's got to be what's that next dimension beyond the specific thing you're doing? How does it play into something that matters and affects people across the world? And so that's where government service gives you those opportunities, as well as supporting the government. As I mentioned before, you can work in industry and be totally tight with government. And that's one of the things that I think is really important these days, because nowadays in national security and intelligence, there are a lot of things that are out in industry that didn't used to be. And so when I was coming along, a lot of the things we were pursuing technologically, they only had one market, big data analytics for understanding what's happening in the world that could be dangerous for our security. Well, now there are all types of outcomes that those same analytics can be used for in industry, in the commercial sense. And so we need industry to be side saddle, part and parcel with the government so that the best solutions are brought to bear for national security as well as for the commercial pursuits. That wasn't the case when I came along as much. And you see now this push to bring innovation into the government. There's a big push in the current administration to change the acquisition framework to make it more amenable for startups, for emerging tech to come in and have a role and to do it more quickly and seamlessly. That's needed incredibly because the information age is different from building aircraft carriers, right? Aircraft carriers are extremely sophisticated, takes several years. Whereas look how fast AI has changed the world. It's been like a year or two since November of 22 when ChatGPT hit the world. And you look back now and you can't imagine it not being there. That is extremely fast. And so we've got to understand that and engage it. And so industry's got to have a role working with government for the best solutions.
And one of my observations as you were talking is the loyalty towards companies and people, like individuals, get loyalty towards themselves. I have noticed that. One thing I've also observed is like maybe lack of like community. I know you said you're from like a rural town when you grew up, but one thing that was even like, I don't know, when I was like growing up, was like if you ran out of like sugar, you'd go next door and ask the neighbor. People just wouldn't do that nowadays. It'd be really a foreign, weird, creepy thing to do. So do you think just the way in which, unfortunately, people are quite polarized now, people get different beliefs and therefore they don't want to see it as like a human to a human, that has driven a lot of people away from public service, would you say?
I'm just thinking there's a lot there because I think about community. And when I grew up, you had smaller houses and bigger yards. And nowadays, the houses take up the yard because everybody comes into the garage, into their house. They're totally connected to their family and to their networks. And the neighbors, that's like, well, I might know who they are, I might not. And so we live a very different life in general now. And of course, in rural America and rural areas, that's still more community oriented. But it's unfortunate. And so that is a migration of how we engage, which I think hurts us from a standpoint of, on the one hand, we're very connected, but on the other hand, we don't get those ad hoc little things. And I'm lucky because I live in a semi-rural area, so I end up talking to my neighbors across the horse fence, and we would lean on each other, and we do, but that's more and more rare.
Yeah, so I think just to extend on that a little bit more would just be like, do you think that's been a deterrent because of just how we are nowadays? That's rare. Do you think that's been a deterrent then to sort of like people taking up careers in like public service? And how do we get them back there then?
Yeah, I think my experience, and I don't know the current stats, but my experience was when I left NSA 2 years ago, we had, I don't know, 80 to 100,000 applicants a year. People wanted to come in. And, I talked to my former boss and colleague, General Paul Nakasone, and he's involved down at the Vanderbilt University in Tennessee with the National Security Institute. And the whole idea in these institutes, and I support the Virginia Tech National Security Institute and those types of places. And so my point is academia has a role in exposing children to the bigger picture. And you see a lot of universities that continue to get a lot of following by kids who want to serve. I mean, I even have had interns at my current company, Red Cell Partners, and they come in and we're building startups for commercial, but also for national security. And I have mentoring sessions with them, and they're working through college, but they ask me all about this government service thing because it's something that many of them, I had one last year, her family was there was a Navy lineage, and, there were Navy SEALs in her family, and she just she didn't know what she was gonna do, and ultimately, she ended up working for Dell when she graduated, but she was driven to do something that mattered, and I know that her exposure to us and her exposure mostly to her family is gonna guide her path, right? And so I think it does start a lot with family, but not strictly. And that's the nice thing about a lot of these universities that are trying to expose kids. I've gone several times to UT Austin. There's a intelligence studies program that I found for data time and spoken and met with the kids. And it's just so gratifying. And they're very inquisitive and they know, the ones, especially in the technical degrees, they could go off and make a lot more money, but they're looking for something that matters. They're looking for purpose. And so I think that's something the government can bring. And of course, industry can bring it as well. But there's just something I used to tell people in the government, who else has your job? And it's most everybody I knew, their job was very unique in some way, and not just unique in the government, but unique in the country or the world. Right. And so that gives people a very special feeling of having the ability to have an impact that matters, touching things that have relevance, and not just feeling like they're on an assembly line.
Yeah, and then would you say it's a fair assumption, and I know you mentioned at the start that the public sector just gives you something different than the private sector. Do you think that's a lot by purpose and, the greater mission? Would you say you just can't, maybe not all the time, get in the private sector?
Right. Most definitely. And this is where, my daughter's case in point. I mean, she was in the private sector, but she was working with a company that had development contracts for the government. And so she was connected, but it was a couple steps away from touching the act. And so she wanted to be closer to the mission, the way the technology was being used. And that's what she ended up doing. And so I think this whole thing about number one, having any connection to it gives a feeling of purpose, but various people are drawn to be closer and closer or be like right there, right? And that's where, what in my career, I was just so fortunate because I was like in the room, they call it, There's a book about that, being in the room. I've been in the middle of lots of things in my career. When I was deputy director, I was on the deputies committee for the national security apparatus in our country. And so I was in the White House all the time as the interagencies construct there was deliberating on security strategy, situations in the world, our policies on how to deal with them. And so I was bringing the perspective of what my agency's mission was to that discussion. So I was not generating policy. I was providing data to inform policy making, but I was sitting right there, part and parcel to those discussions and seeing that process play out. It was very meaningful. I mean, to be in the middle of those types of things, to watch what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the whole ramp up to that, I was very proud that the intelligence community provided awareness and insight and even timing of that event before it happened. And it just was very intense to know that you were in the middle of something that mattered so greatly. And that happened multiple times in my career. And, I was involved in making things happen so wars never happened. And that was just a major, wonderful feeling, right? Saving lives as our service people, our men and women dedicated to their country, living out forward in harm's way and providing intel that kept them from dying was just like, there's nothing that replaces that feeling, especially when somebody lives to come back and thank you. It's so powerful that I'm shivering just thinking about it because I remember that happening multiple times. And so that's just something that you can't replicate very easily.
Yeah, well, I love that, and I can hear it in your voice that, you are driven by that mission, and I said that at the top of this call, and I can sense that, and it means a lot for you to come on and share your thoughts and your experiences and inspire the next, people currently working in the industry or, other people that want to sort of transfer, so I was really moved by that, so thank you.
No, thank you. I just really love the opportunity. And, as I've learned coming out in industry on purpose, I've dumped back and I'm engaged with young people, which really drives and energizes me. And just seeing, helping people pick their path and find ways to do things that matter. That's just so important. It's not just about making money. It's about, yes, having a comfortable life if you can. But in the end, it's doing things that matter and helping people have a better life. And so what better motivation could you have?
So then, George, my final question to you would be if we were to zoom out of our conversation, I know we've gone quite detailed. What do you think sort of moving forward for the industry, whether that's, for defense, for governments, for the private, public sector, like what are you thinking?
The first thing that pops in my mind, of course, is this journey in artificial intelligence, right? Because it is so monumental, is dramatically changing how we operate in the world, how we connect with technology, and the rate of change is something we could never have predicted. And it's accelerating. I've been through lots of different step changes in technology, and there's nothing like this that's happened in my lifetime to date. And so I think that is going to be the continued story of the coming year as society engages, leverages, but then also tries to manage the power of this technology. And it's multifaceted, it's societal. It's not just like buying an app and using tech, because the fact that these technologies are taking on right now, teaming with humans as opposed to being just subordinate to humans. But now we're actually dealing with very high and I think real probability that we will have the beginnings of this AGI thing people talk about, artificial general intelligence, where, machines can take on more autonomy. And so I've been in discussions about that lately. And the technology is going to bring us to that juncture. And so we have to be thinking about what that means and having discussions about, how do you instill values in an AI system, and how do you actually decide where human society is in guiding and controlling autonomous systems. And so I think we're on the precipice of having to deal with the societal ramifications of technology that is so powerful that we haven't really thought about this stuff before. And that's going to be coming at us next year, right around the corner.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Merckset, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.